Chapter 2 of A New You. February. The room was a clear pink. The paints had finally arrived, and she exuberantly covered every inch of all the canvases with ground. How wonderful it felt to move the brush through the room. She loved the wide, sweeping movements she could make when she was only putting ground upon the canvas, so different from the deliberate little strokes she made when she was painting for real. But maybe the ground could be considered a painting of its own. A painting that was not just about the presence of pink walls all around, but about the gestural dance that she was doing as she finally took the walls from their sterile whiteness to this radiant new hue. She leapt from end to end and smoothed the tinted gesso on the walls, not caring about dripping on the floor because she was painting that as well. The brush was wide and the bristles soft, and the gesso spread like heavy cream as she caressed the canvases. She got the idea to take a brush in each hand and wave her arms like she was holding semaphores as she moved, and covered and dipped and dribbled gesso everywhere, and giggled as she slipped along the floor. As the water ran pink into the little tub, she thought about why she'd selected this particular shade to tint the gesso with. She liked to work by instinct and then analyze and then let the impact of the work take form inside her mind before she took another step. Something about prisoners and bubblegum. And oh yeah, an article she read some time ago about a color called Baker Miller Pink, named after some gracious wardens who allowed a researcher to paint a prison cell bubblegum colored and see what happened. And what happened was that the prisoners grew more docile and stopped attacking one another quite so often. And if she recalled correctly, their heart rates went down and their friendliness went up. They started singing lullabies to one another, and the researchers declared that from then on he would devote his life to touting Baker Miller Pink. She certainly agreed that color had important psychological effects, but she wasn't certain if she actually felt any calmer since the room was pink. She did know that she felt much better since she had a chance to move around, to dance, and she wondered if she was making any progress toward her new language of images. Certainly there was a precedent for this sort of thing in action painting, but the ambidextrous semaphore gesture, combined with the prisoner pink hue and her elected confinement in this place, made her think she might be onto something. An interesting concept, blurring the line between painting a room and painting in a room. What was it, then, that differentiated an artist from the guy who comes and paints your bedroom beige? She'd abandoned representational painting years ago. Could pull off photorealism as well as the next person who had taken far too many art classes. But she had become convinced that abstraction was what it was all about. She liked to read about science and draw her ideas from there. So many fascinating concepts from the taking within the worlds of psychology and neuroscience, and linguistics and physics and math. She didn't always understand everything she read, but she figured that nobody else really did either. And anyhow, she was an artist and didn't need to trouble herself with exact detail. According to Deirdre, you could interpret anything however you wanted, and that was perfectly okay. Her senior thesis project, the one that got the grant people to notice her, was an installation inspired by an article she'd read entitled World's First Brain Prosthesis Revealed. It told of researchers at MIT who developed a silicon chip that could stand in for a hippocampus. the part of the brain responsible for putting experiences into long-term memory. The researchers hadn't tested the chip on slices of rat brain yet, but they had high hopes because they'd been working on it for 10 years now, and they saw no reason why it wouldn't work on live rats and monkeys and people who had trouble remembering things. The article caught her attention because she'd never heard of a hippocampus before, and she loved the sound of the word and the idea that you could replace the hippocampus with a chip. This way, she figured, you could program your brain to remember anything you wanted. When she learned that the word hippocampus was Greek for seashore, so named because the entomologist who discovered it thought that it resembled one. She suddenly visualized the entire installation and shuddered at what she'd seen. A small room painted all around with the ocean and the sky above, and floating atop the water were hundreds of stylized seahorse shapes, black and bloated, and clumped and clearly victims of an ecological disaster. The room was dimly lit, and it held only one person at a time, and when you walked in, you heard a disturbed and urgent whispering from the walls. I can't remember. I can't recall. I can't remember anything. I don't remember. Can't remember. Cannot tell you anything at all. And she sprinkled rotting seaweed in the corners of the room and entitled the piece, The Drowned Seahorse, or World's First Brain Prosthesis Revealed. When she was interviewed about the installation, she talked enthusiastically about a future where nobody would ever forget anything. She scraped the remains of the pink paint off her fingernails, and swaddled her head in a towel. The ground would take some time to dry completely, so she decided to search the web to see if her work so far had been original or not. She sat cross-legged on the soft place within her cube and cradled the little silver computer in her lap. She'd been online since she was a child and could spend hours surfing the web without blinking. First, a visit to her website. The cameras seemed to be working nicely. You could see quite clearly that the room had now been painted pink. And if you clicked on the button labeled Archive, you could see a recording of any time till now. There was no sound to accompany the images. She'd elected against microphones because she didn't want to disrupt the purity of her art with the sound of her footsteps or her breath. She watched a few minutes of herself leaping around and twirling brushes in the air, then turned the image off, embarrassed. She looked terribly fat in the paint-splattered pants she had on, and her arms did not look thin from any angle. She cringed at the thought of people seeing her this way and resolved to do something about her weight. They'd bring her any type of food she wanted, so it was really up to her to determine how large she wanted to be. Fatwatchers.com, eslimming.com, drgord.com, drhudnut.com, thevoid.com, loseweightnaturally.com, loseweightnow.com, and the gesso was dry, but she still had so much to learn about how she ought to be eating that she sat in front of the screen reading until she fell asleep. The next morning she felt miserable. She had eaten an entire bag of gummy worms while looking for information about the proper way to eat, and so resolved to give up candy for the day. And with that resolution in mind, she began her original task of researching the history of action painting. Links led to links, and then to a page that really caught her imagination. It was entitled robotics.com, and it belonged to an artist named Rob, who used little robots to paint. The robots were driven by neural networks, just like the human brain, and their wheels released paint as they danced over canvas. Rob seemed to know quite a lot about how the human brain worked. He had an entire section on his website detailing the memory behind the robots, the theory behind the robots. They were built with simple sensors that detected motion and light and sound, and these sensors fed into a computer brain that changed and learned with experience, just like the neurons in a human brain. The robots started out moving quite randomly, but eventually learned to avoid bumping into one another, and even developed what looked like moods and personalities, which of course raised important questions about in- innates and consciousness. Excuse me. Rob seemed to have been very successful with his robots, or robots, as he called them. Uh, she read his whole biography and felt quite jealous. He was always having shows and performances, and had even appeared on television and in a short documentary film. In the images section of his website, there were many pictures of Rob staring intensely at his robots. Rob pointing confidently at a diagram of a neural network. Rob looking suave at an opening standing next to several beautiful women. She wondered if Rob was single. He didn't say anything about his professional life anywhere on his website, and he didn't seem to be standing next to any woman in particular in the pictures. She found an interview of him from Modern Cyborg magazine in which he stated that living with someone isn't easy with a bunch of robots running around. But the article was from a few years before, and his statement was ambiguous in any case. She could not stop thinking about Rob as she dressed to go outside her cube and paint. What if he was watching her? She put on some control top stockings and ignored the way they ate into her waist. Short black painted splattered skirt and worn black t-shirt, and she was ready to present herself again. 2 brushes, smaller this time, and a batch of light green paint to contrast perfectly with pink. She wanted to keep playing with the semaphore idea, but with gestures that were much smaller and more deliberate. And her hands began to move in abstract patterns that were mirror images of one another, except that the right side was wilder and less precise. Was this what her brain looked like inside? She'd drawn these intricate arboresque patterns instinctively for years now, fluid and recursive and mysterious even to her. All she had to do was put mark maker to surface, and the designs would fall out before she even realized it. She would sometimes even draw them in the air with her fingers, conducting a visual-spatial orchestra for nobody to see. But now there were people watching her. How many exactly she didn't know. So she put the brushes down and began to trace out arboresques with her index fingers against the surface of the walls. When she looked at herself on her website, she was pleased to note that the skirt and stockings made her look more attractive. No matter that the elastic left a deep red welt around her waist and felt a bit constricting. She looked slimmer in her images, and that was what she'd wanted to achieve. But slimmer was not all. She was amazed to see that she'd fallen into some sort of trance while she was painting arboresques in the air. Primitive and rhythmic and completely uninhabited. She let those patterns move her body all around the room. Had she taken action painting one step further by eliminating the paint? Or had Fluxus already done this years ago? Once the postmodern barrier had been broken, there was nowhere really left to go. Nothing was sacred or surprising or new. But she wasn't going to let that stop her from creating art. She had to just listen to her urges and forget about the rest. It was interesting to watch the differences between her hands as they mirrored one another through the air. Her right hand was so much more expressive and moved raw and dramatic, and her left hand moved with such delicacy and control. She'd felt that difference while she was air painting, and it was incredible to watch. She wondered how the pattern making was related to language. It felt so much like writing when she made these abstract movements. Were her arabesque a sort of language that she couldn't yet decipher? Maybe Rob would have some insights into this. She looked into a mirror and remembered those beautiful women by Rob's side in the pictures on his website. She decided that her eyebrows needed to be narrower. She'd heard that you weren't supposed to touch the top arch of the eyebrow, but only pluck from underneath. So she went to work along the bottom edge, flinching from the sting as she ripped out each little hair. The area was reddened and puffy when she finished, but she definitely looked more glamorous than she did before. Rob had put an email address on his website, so she figured she could get in touch with him that way. Anybody that interested in technology would check his email fairly often, she reasoned. So if she sent a note, he'd definitely write back quickly. She sat in the little tub and shaved her legs as she composed a note in her head, a note that would get Rob to notice her. Her skin was pale and sensitive and chafed quite easily, so she had to be very careful how she shaved. Deep soaking first in water and then gobs of cream. The cream she smoothed it on and methodically slid the razor along her leg, trying not to skin her ankles as she'd done so many times before. Her hair was dark and grew back quickly, so she had to shave her legs quite regularly if she wanted them to look at all attractive. She recalled a time in junior high school when she'd gotten teased for having stubble around her ankles. After that, she'd never missed a spot. A dot or two of blood on the rough parts of her knees. Not bad, and she kept going, over and over the note to Rob. It couldn't be too formal, or too coy, or too forward. She had to leave just the right amount of mystery while letting him know enough to make sure he'd be interested. Anyhow, she only wanted his feedback about her work as a fellow professional, and she didn't know why her head was always going off into these silly fantasies. Enough. A simple email then, just a note to let him know she liked his work and was currently working on a year-long project that could be viewed remotely, if he wanted. A friendly introduction, nothing more. She sent it off and went straight to bed because she couldn't stand to wait awake for an answer. And that's the end of chapter 2.